Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Kurt Watinsky, and this is one of a series of interviews I've been conducting as part of the More Housing Wisconsin project, which is co-sponsored by the League of Wisconsin Municipalities, the Wisconsin Realtors Association, and the Wisconsin Builders Association. The focus of this series of interviews has been on housing, but more particularly, what can local governments do to generate more housing? We've been talking with and learning from local leaders representing both the public sector and the private sector, as well as educators who've had some experience either developing or implementing zoning reform changes designed to bring about more housing, create more density, or other policy changes at the local level that are intended to create or help create more housing for the people who want to live and work in our communities. Joining me today is Kelly Westlund. Kelly is the housing educator for UW Extension. She's headquartered in Bayfield County, and I think you told me, Kelly, you're the only housing educator across the UW Extension network. And then one other thing I'll add to her biography is that she served on the Ashland City Council a few years back for a couple terms, I think. And so, Kelly, welcome and thank you for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Kurt. It's great to be with you, and thank you for all of the work that you've done in this series until this point. There's a lot of good information there for sure. And you are correct that I am the only housing educator within the extension system at this point. It's a pilot position, and we have just finished up the first 2 years with two more to go. But here's hoping that we can replicate this and build out these resources for communities across the state.
Great. Well, yeah, why don't you tell us a little bit more about your role as a housing educator and what it involves and what resources might be available to local officials around the state?
Sure. Well, it started several years back when our community and economic development educator, which is a position many counties have through extension, much of her time was kind of going into efforts to address the housing shortage in the region. And eventually they reached a point where they realized that there was enough work there to be done to, have an entirely separate person who could take those things on so she could get back to the other items on her plate. And so between Extension and Bayfield County, they agreed to co-fund a new position, and that's where it all started. I joined early 2023, and because it was sort of this first effort, much of my early work was just getting my bearings, understanding more about the dynamics that were coming into play, the existing resources, some of the ongoing work that other partners were doing, and from there started to kind of figure out which of the low hanging fruit opportunities might be available or what pieces we could put into place to move things forward. And at the same time, prior to this position being created, Bayfield County, Ashland County, and I think 14 other local units of government had formed the Shawinigan Bay Regional Housing Coalition, and they applied to WIDA as a part of their Rural Affordable Workforce Housing Initiative in 2020 and were selected as one of the three pilot communities. So out of that work, we identified three potential solutions that could really help us deal with our housing shortage, one of which was a comprehensive housing forward zoning reform, one that was supporting small scale developers, homegrown emerging talent to try to get some of those pieces into place. And then lastly, it was the establishment of a community land trust to serve both Ashland and Bayfield counties, which is a relatively new model for most Wisconsinites, even though we are the fifth of this kind of organization that's already established here. So really, this position sort of became a catch-all for whatever housing related, questions or efforts we wanted to put forward at the time.
Great. So do you, in your role, are you kind of organizing meetings or bringing these groups together and initiating discussions and stuff like that among communities?
Yes. So one of the approaches that we've been able to use with some success here is to go into our local towns and talk with them about what their specific needs are and who the players are in their community, and to convene those folks for some of these conversations. UW Extension has often played the role of convener, right?
Yeah.
So that's not too much different in what I'm doing, but I've also been, chasing grant resources or enlisting some of our larger state and national partners in our efforts. Some of it's doing the work to research case studies of interesting models that folks are using in other places and figuring out how we can adapt those to meet our needs. It might also be sort of thinking about, for example, I think I've mentioned to you in the past that Bayfield County, as a destination retirement, remote rural gateway kind of community, we have more than 40% of our total housing units are considered vacant as second homes or short-term rentals. So thinking about what kinds of strategies our local units of government can employ without running afoul of the state statutes when it comes to trying to mitigate that impact on availability and affordability of housing in our community.
Great. Yeah, those are all issues that resonate statewide, as you know. And
Yeah.
one of the issues that I'd like to have our conversation here this morning or this afternoon focus on is uh, NIMBYism. And it seems like no matter what size community you are, or what initial efforts you're engaging in to try and lay the groundwork for the possibility of more types of housing and a variety of housing and different price points of housing in your community. Um, there's concern by existing homeowners often, or people living in the neighborhood already, that are concerned about the possibility of, density. That means apartments. We're mainly a single family neighborhood. We don't, yeah, you've heard these concerns that come up before. And I'm wondering if in some of your discussions and work with communities in the Chequamegon Bay Area, you've encountered some of this not in my backyard, initial fear-driven opposition to changes that would bring about more housing. And if you have any ideas or kind of best practices that you might recommend other communities.
Sure. Let me start by saying, Bayfield County hasn't taken on the whole process of updating zoning code just yet. We have a number of public input forums scheduled for January, and we have enlisted a consulting firm to help us navigate the first comprehensive reform in 50 years or so, which I
Yeah.
don't think that we're alone in that,
No.
actually. It's been a lot of piecemeal stuff to this until recently, and now the communities are kind of trying to step back and figure out how all of this is actually coherent or navigable for our developers. I think it's a lot of communities doing that as a result of the requirement in order to gain access to the new WIDA revolving loan fund.
Yes.
So that's a good thing. Regarding NIMBYism, yes, this is something that I don't think it'll surprise anybody to hear that, we've encountered it in pretty much every community where we're talking about housing, right?
Yep.
And just for context, a few years back, some folks who serve on the board for our local public housing authority were recognizing the need for more units, right? And they have all these existing complexes in different corners of what is a very large county. Bayfield County currently is, it's like 11 people per square mile. If you drive from the tip top in Cornucopia to the bottom in Cable, you're in the car for a good hour and a half, if not longer, depending on the
Yes.
weather. So it's not like we're super compact and able to do a lot of things that could move more quickly if we were dense, more dense. But where we have had, where this group of board members from the local housing authority were making presentations, it did span communities throughout the county. And in some cases, folks perceived that as, an outside entity trying to force their hand. They didn't feel like they'd had a lot of input. They assumed that the decision was already made and that this was not something that they would have a say in. And as a result, some, private citizens, as they are, entitled to do, went out and sent mailers to every household within a given zip code, basically raising all of the fears of what would come if we were to allow additional development of subsidized or low-income housing.
Hmm.
And a lot of the fears revolved around like who's going to live in them. Are these going to attract crime? Is this for undesirable populations, or
Hmm.
somebody else is going to lower property values?
Right.
And every community over and over and over again. So it was really making it more challenging. And I, coming in, looked to some models from other university programs that were a little more established. And Iowa's been focusing on rural housing for some time, and they use a rural housing readiness process where they will connect with folks in community and identify people who have some interest in this issue and get them to form the committee that does sort of the analysis of the baseline. What are the opportunities? What are the challenges? What barriers exist? What can we fix to make developing in our community more attractive? And to think about what populations they're trying to serve, how many units might make sense to actually address the need that they have. And some of these communities have even gone so far as to develop parcel inventories where they have identified the locations that are either owned by a willing seller or a local unit of government that are close to existing infrastructure, that sort of thing.
Yes.
And to kind of, be able to move that forward with that work to put out RFPs for new development. Um, there have been different outcomes in the different communities where we've tried this, right? So, one that I think has made a really positive difference is up in Cornucopia, where there was a local group working to build basically housing for independent seniors who wanted to age in place. I again don't think it's a surprise to anybody that are involved in these conversations that we're all staying in our single family homes longer than we used to, but we're also all living longer. And when folks retire here and embrace their vacation land as their new place, they build relationships and they don't want to pick up and leave just because they are no longer in a position to maintain a single family home or do their own plowing or mowing or whatever. So we've heard a loud cry for the need for more housing suitable for seniors. And in Cornucopia, when we first started exploring this, again, in partnership with our county housing authority, folks were concerned about like, what does the application process look like? How do we know that new residents are going to be from here or that they're going to be documented or that they're going to have no criminal records? And just bringing in somebody who was an authority with good information made a huge difference.
Uh-huh.
So the executive director of our local housing authority came in and like went through the application with all the members of this committee and anybody interested who was present, and made it clear that you need a criminal background check, you need a credit check, you need references from previous landlords, all this stuff that helped off the top mitigate a number of those concerns. So otherwise, I would say the ongoing and regular opportunities for early and meaningful engagement and community input is it's been critical to changing minds about how we move these efforts forward.
Yeah, that's a good example of, and I wasn't familiar with the Iowa approach, but yeah, kind of laying the groundwork, addressing initial concerns with facts and information to
Mhm,
try and alleviate those concerns.
mhm,
Another, I've been reading some of the literature on this, obviously, too, as I'm working on more Housing Wisconsin stuff. And I saw that another way to, I don't know, educate people who are concerned about changes either in the zoning code that would allow certain structures that they're not used to having in their neighborhood, like let's say a triplex or a quadplex or
mhm,
something like that in an otherwise single family district, is to actually just show examples, illustrate with photographs, actual examples in their community or surrounding communities.
mhm,
Say, well, this is what we're talking about. It's about the same size as a, this kind of house, but it actually has four units in it instead of
mhm,
one. And it's not out of place necessarily in these communities. And this is what we're talking about. And kind of alleviates some of those initial concerns that people think, oh, an apartment building, oh, it's going to be huge. It's going to be
mhm.
out of character with our surrounding neighborhood.
Sure.
Yeah, so all those efforts to kind of lay the groundwork, get out of front of
Mhm,
some of the concerns. I'm interested.
sure.
So have you held some like I don't know listening sessions with some of these communities or within the county to try and lay the groundwork for zoning changes and other things that will be coming that might address some of the housing issues.
Yes. So like I said, the Bayfield County is set to initiate its comprehensive housing forward zoning rewrite in
Right.
January, and we have, oh gosh, it must be close to a dozen public input opportunities built into that schedule. But
Hmm.
I think again, Cornucopia is a great example of this. As we moved this project forward, we pursued one of the Thrive Rural grants that were being offered through the Office of Rural Prosperity at WEDC, and were awarded one of those. And it comes with 2 years of technical assistance and two $25,000 pre-development grant opportunities. And so one of the first things we did was to be really, really intentional about public engagement. And the first bit of that funding went actually to a different entity within UW Extension, which is the Creative Vitality and Placemaking Initiative.
Yeah.
And there's a team called Design Wisconsin. I'm not sure if you're familiar, but they're great. They will go into a community and help members of that community really envision what changes they might like to just make it their own and to
Hmm.
prepare it for the future. And they, in the lead up to this, we were able to conduct a pretty comprehensive survey that had a great response. Over 50% of what we sent out came back.
Oh,
We were able to get mailers out to every person in the town and to show up to these public input sessions. And so a lot of this builds to what they call a design charrette, where a team of volunteer architects and planners and others were convened. And they did a sort of anonymized input process so that everybody in the room from Cornucopia could say what they really thought without all their neighbors knowing where it came from.
Yeah.
So it's a facilitated process, but we came out of that with lots of valuable input that will help guide the design ultimately. And it also helped to surface some issues of concern, like again, I'm sure you've heard about how many rural communities struggle to find volunteers for emergency first responders, for example.
Yes.
And if we're building another development for independent seniors in this far-flung rural community, we have to address the concerns associated with getting them medical care in an emergency, right?
Right.
So it was a really, I think after that process, folks began to really take to heart that we care what they think, that we're not trying to come in and show them what we think would work best in their community. We're trying to get them to think about what would actually work best to meet their needs and be driven by folks who live and work there right now. One other thing that I think is related and worth mentioning is that when communities have sort of this response to not wanting anything that is considered low income, and most of the programs that we're working with will allow for folks up to 80% of area median income to benefit from those programs.
Yeah.
And we look at the occupations where we have these existing needs, first responders, law enforcement, education, healthcare, a number of those positions hiring in these communities, their starting wages are directly in line with that 80% AMI. And if you
Exactly.
want these folks to come here, you've got to build housing they can afford.
Yes.
That's it.
Yeah. Yeah. That is so true. That's what we use the term workforce housing. There's all
Mm-hmm.
kinds of terminology you can use to try and capture that idea that, yeah, we want the
Mm-hmm.
people who serve our communities and are necessary for our thriving economy to be able to live and work in our community.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And we see some of this too. It's not even just for, those critical sectors, but if you look at communities like the city of Bayfield or La Pointe on Madeline Island,
Yeah.
they are very much driven by a high tourist season. And when tourists come here now and they recognize that the shops and the restaurants and things like that are maybe open part of the week, whereas in previous years they were open more,
Hmm.
that is an illustration of the fact that the service workers who would work in those hospitality jobs, those entertainment or retail, they can't afford to live in those communities anymore. And this is going to send more ripple effects out through our community unless we get really, really intentional about building that workforce housing to make sure that they can afford to be in these communities as well. So,
Right. And
yeah.
generally, these are not going to be single family homes. These are going to be some kind of apartment complex.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And that's not only, I mean, that is not unique, as you know, in Bayfield and Chequamegon Bay. It's Door County and the Dells
Hmm.
and Minocqua area. All the hospitality service workers
Hmm.
are finding it more and more difficult to live in those communities. They have to commute, or they just don't,
Right.
like you said, they don't have enough, so they're closed for, Tuesday, Monday, and Wednesday.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's not ideal, that's for sure. But
Right.
helping, especially like resistant local elected officials, make the connection between the jobs that you want to fill and what they pay and
Hmm.
comparing them to what's realistic as far as new housing, I think is a good approach that makes a lot of sense for people.
What is the status of the senior housing? I thought the in the cornucopia, that's what the kind of this buildup was
Yeah.
working towards, right? What is there?
Yeah.
Is it something going to
Well,
happen? Yeah.
so after the design charrette, which was at the end of September, we have identified the specific location that we'd like to pursue. We have agreement from the property owner that we can move forward with site surveys and combining the parcels. But first, we've got to do some of the necessary things like asking the town to vacate an alley that separates
Okay.
some of the
Yep.
parcels.
Yep.
Um, and then we'll be able to do wetland delineation in the spring. But we've got everything that we need or will when that surveying is complete to put together a request for proposals that we can release in hopes of finding a development partner,
Great. Yeah.
which
So
is very exciting stuff.
it is. It is.
Very-
And this is right. This is this type of work that's being done in conjunction, local governments, UW Extension, county, everyone's kind of,
Mhm.
there are many communities in this exact same situation, trying to
Yeah.
lay the groundwork and then bring a request for proposal forward to see if there's a developer who come in and either put in, workforce housing or
Hmm.
attainable, affordable housing, or somehow subsidized
Yeah,
housing or senior
sure.
housing. Yeah.
And like hearing you kind of rattle off all of those terms, that's one of the challenges as far as the NIMBY thing, right? Is that if we say it's low income housing, if we say it's subsidized housing, if we say it's workforce housing, then they all feel like euphemisms for the same thing that they don't want, you know?
Right. Right.
um, and I think it's worth, at least in the conversations we've been having, acknowledging that we don't all share the same definition of affordable, right? If we're going with
Right.
what HUD says, then it doesn't matter how much money you make. It's if 30% of your total household income is being used for the purposes of housing, or if it's more than that, then you are burdened, regardless of if you make $1 million a year or 10,000, you know?
Yes.
Um, and we need housing for pretty much every income level across the board of every shape and size. So I don't think that anyone in northern Wisconsin is going to turn down, a 6 unit luxury development just because
Yeah.
because
No,
they'd prefer to have 40 units of affordable housing. So
exactly. Yep. So, Kelly, this is all interesting and very informative and helpful for other communities around the state. Are there any other last minute items you want to touch on related to NIMBYism or any of your work in related to housing?
sure. I guess as far as the NIMBYism, I just can't stress how important it is to identify those concerns up front and then try to address them directly with good information and trusted advocates from that community. That makes a big difference when it's led by folks who already live and work there. And as far as some of the local policies that we've been able to implement and are still sort of waiting to see how they actually pan out, Bayfield County, I think, is unique in having imposed on tax foreclosure properties that sell. There are some deed restrictions. While the county is in ownership of that parcel, they will attach the requirement that if it is an existing residential structure, that it be occupied by a long-term resident within 6 months. If it is a buildable lot without a structure, they have 2 years to have a long-term residence. And then lastly, that any of the parcels that go through the tax foreclosure process cannot be permitted as a short-term rental for at least 10 years after the date of sale. So it's marginal, but we're interested to see how it goes.
Interesting. Yeah, that I wasn't aware of that policy that the county had adopted. That's interesting.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, something different.
Yeah. I'll be watching that, see how that works. One thing that you touched on also, and I want to emphasize is this kind of the importance of having people that uh, are listening to the concerns of existing
Mhm.
homeowners or neighbors or members of the community and
Mhm.
people that those members of the community can trust. So you have to
Mhm.
respectfully listen, hear their concerns, and then try and address them in the best way
Mhm.
possible. And I think
Yeah.
that is a critical point that people
Yeah.
need to, I don't know, underscore. That needs to be underscored.
Yeah. And I know that it's time consuming and expensive to do like regular ongoing public input opportunities, but even just making like an online comment form available or hosting an open house before a project moves into permitting, those kinds of things can really make a big difference in terms of building local support and goodwill. So
That's good
worth it.
advice to end on here. Kelly, thank you very much for taking the time to be with me and talk a little bit about this issue. I appreciate it. I'll be watching with curiosity and my fingers crossed on some of the work that you're doing that'll come to fruition at the senior housing project and things like that. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure talking to you, Kurt.